What do you say, folks? Should we get started?
Yes, I think that sounds like a good idea. Sammy, are we there? Pretty much? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jean Singer, the Goosefoot Board President, and I just want to welcome everybody who has signed up. Here's where we're going tonight. I'm going to introduce the partners to this workforce housing master planning. We're going to go through the housing need and the vision, an overview of Bayview as an area, housing analysis and demand, preliminary master plan, where we are right now, which is very, very preliminary. Placemaking, what does it mean? The area that we're creating the place of Bayview. We're going to have about 30 minutes of Q&A and then some next steps in closing. Could I have the next slide? Great. Here's some Zoom etiquette for those of you. It'll make it a lot easier. We're muting all of you. And all questions should be written in the chat, which you have a little icon on the bottom. And we'll answer as many as we can. Sammy from Goosefoot and Marion are going to be working those back and forth. And thank you very much. And whatever questions that we can't get to, we'll go into a fact sheet. And turn on your video if possible. It's much nicer to speak to faces. So let me introduce our partners in this. The collaborators, very active collaborators, are Goosefoot Community Fund, the Henny Family, Legacy Family Tree, Island Senior Resources. Our supporters, Whidbey Health and Island County, consultants, Schemata Workshop, Architecture, MIG, Civil Engineering, Spectrum Development Solutions, and David Mesielek, who is Septic Design, and we're looking alternative septic and sewer systems, and our very, very own Jerry Stonebridge on Whidbey Island. So we're going to rock and roll, and I'm going to hand this over to Chris Salamone, who is our board vice president. Thanks.
Gotta unmute yourself, Chris.
Chris, are you unmuted?
Did that work? Okay. Am I here now?
Yes.
Thank you. Technology is wonderful. Thank you, Jean. And what I'd like to do is set some context for where we are today. As all of you know, affordable workforce housing has been an issue on the island in recent years. And in order to validate that, in the history of this process, Goosefoot decided to make it their top priority in 2017. Following that, more validation was determined by the housing needs study that was done in the comp plan for Island County. And following that, we did our own survey. It seems self-evident that workforce housing on the island is one of the greatest needs, if not the greatest needs. In 2019, workshops were conducted by Commissioner Helen Price Johnson, and it brought together community members to see if we could focus on a solution for this issue and look at opportunities. So that was in 2019. Time passed, and by 2020, Goosefoot decided the magic of the market wasn't going to create a solution for this problem. So why now and why Bayview? We looked around with zoning in the island. There are 4 areas on the island where we could potentially create multifamily housing that could be affordable. One of those is the Bayview raid. So rather than wait, it seemed like the the market wasn't going to come to this issue, we decided to fund the process, and we brought in a consultant team to do that. Our idea was Bayview will develop in an ad hoc fashion over time in a haphazard way because of its location. What we wanted to do was be proactive and set up a development pattern with a master plan for a true community, an interrelated neighborhood. So we decided to begin that process. We set up a leadership team composed of the ownership and the county. Now, circumstances sort of conspired to make this opportunity one to be optimistic about. The biggest impediment to doing affordable housing is generally finding a site that has zoning that's appropriate, finding a site that has neighborhood support and doesn't have a NIMBY issue, and having political will. So the site that we're talking about, Bayview, is not developed, and primarily because of the ownership pattern on it. It's 100 acres, 50 of which are vacant, an opportunity for creating neighborhoods and housing. The ownership, this is a very unique undertaking because this process is being led by 4 owners. One is a nonprofit, Goosefoot. One is basically a nonprofit, Whidbey Health. One is the county, who have an ownership position, a public entity, and one is Whidbey Telecom and the Henney family, who are not in the real estate development business. So those owners got together with us and said, we support creating affordable housing in this area. So we have some reason to be optimistic because of those reasons. By serendipity, this is a unique process. This area has infrastructure, and so it has the things that support housing. Generally, housing goes first and infrastructure and retail and other issues follow. What we have in the Bayview RAID, the rural area of intense development, this zone, this 100-acre zone, is we have infrastructure in place. You can see we have the road system in place, we have power, we have water, we have a transit system, we have social services, we have retail, we have food service, we have events, we have things that would support a housing neighborhood community in place, but no housing. So as we undertake this, we feel that there's an opportunity to create a sustainable, livable, walkable neighborhood if we're deliberate about our planning. And so that's where we are today. We have the demand. The demand obviously exists on the island. And despite the demand, there has not been a private sector approach to this issue. We consider this issue critical to the future of the island. We don't want the island to lack a workforce, not to have turnover in that workforce, not to have upward pressure on wages in that workforce. We want to have a genuine community with families and kids and a workforce that can live on the island. So that's why it's called a vision. It's the Bayview Vision Master Planning process. We're hoping to develop a plan that has predictable, sustainable development out of that vision to create a district that's interrelated and works. And that's the quest we're on today.
Great. So my job is to share with you sort of the overview of what the Bayview RAID is. I'm Grace Kim. I'm an architect and one of the owners of Slata Workshop, an architecture and urban design firm. And as Chris noted, the RAID, which is a terrible acronym, we admit, is an acronym for a rural area of intense development, of which there are several on Whidbey Island. And the types of uses that are allowed are commercial, light manufacturing, and multifamily housing. Single family housing is expressly not allowed in this area of intense development. The height limits in this area are a maximum of 3 stories, and the density that's allowed is determined by the capacity for sewer and stormwater. And so there's no maximum except what is allowed by those sort of limiting things of how big of a septic field do you need to support the housing that you're trying to create, or the uses that you're trying to create. To take you through a little bit of the existing context, the circulation you can see here, we took from the intersection of the highway and of Bayview Road, we drew a circle that represents a 5-minute walk from that intersection. And so you can see that from within 5 to 10 minutes, you can get from the north end, the tap room, all the way down to Goosefoot, or the Goose, the grocery store. And then these other lines represent sort of the transportation, the transit access that there is east-west across the island and up north to Langley. And so this is some of the infrastructure that we're thinking about, and we're also acknowledging there is already a park and ride. And what we've talked with some of the other departments, WashDOT, Island County Transit, to understand what their future planning is for maybe additional transit infrastructure, bike infrastructure, and things like that. So we will be layering in that information to the overall master plan. The existing amenities and services, as Chris noted, there are lots of amenities and retail opportunities in this area, which you're fortunate. Normally what happens is an area gets developed, the housing goes in, and you have to wait a long time for the rest of the services to come. But in your case, a lot of those services and neighborhood amenities are already there. And so how do we, so it's, the area is ripe for the housing development. In terms of existing site systems, we layered onto the map the topography of the area, where the existing wells are, the local drainage fields that we know right immediately in our context, and then also looked at like the topography and where water wants to naturally flow to. The light blue areas here also represent the known mapped wetlands. And so we're taking all of that into consideration when we think about like where might we place housing. As Chris noted, there is about 50 lots that are undeveloped or underdeveloped in the area. And so we started looking at those to think about where would it make sense to put the housing. And in the 2 areas that we already know that there's a lot of commercial activity and a lot of commercial development, we didn't think that it was compatible to put that housing right there. We also looked at the institutional uses, the hospital owns some of the property, as Chris mentioned. So those properties are sort of off the table at present. There is some potential planning that is happening around those sites. And then we looked at this area here. It's heavily wooded. We were not interested in undertaking a logging activity in order to make the housing available. And then looking at also what areas were mapped as wetlands and trying to stay clear of those areas for now. So that kind of left this hole in the middle, the donut effect. So we are focusing our efforts on the properties and the parcels that are sort of there. And I will turn it over with that to Jake to talk about the housing analysis.
Thank you, Grace, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Jake McKinstry. I'm a principal at Spectrum Development Solutions. It's been an honor to work with Goosefoot and all of our collaborators on this project. And our expertise at Spectrum really is focusing on housing advisory and development of workforce housing. So the missing middle, people that are low income, middle income, that are getting priced out of the market in all communities around the country right now, and particularly in cities that are acutely seeing demand and growth, and there are a lot of different components to it. So part of what we want to do, and I think Chris hit it on the head when he mentioned the 2 words of predictable and sustainable. And housing affordability can take a lot of different forms and shapes. And so our job and role on this project is to really help shape that and make sure that it is predictable and sustainable in the future for who's going to live here, because this is very much the long-term ethos of what we're doing. And before we get into any kind of analysis of the demand and who might live there and the levels of affordability, we like to start kind of at a macro level. So I think we'll just start walking through that a little bit with you tonight. And then we'll get into some of the deeper numbers on who might live here, what the affordability looks like, and some of the ranges. So starting with Island County population, which obviously Island County is comprised primarily of Whidbey and Camano Islands, it's really remained fairly stagnant over the last 5 years. So little population growth. There is more projected growth in the future. Over 30% of the population lives up in Oak Harbor for Island County, so heavily concentrated up there. So Island County employment, again, we took non-military out and trying to kind of take Oak Harbor and some of the skewing there with the military jobs and really kind of focused outside of government employment. Where are the jobs on the island in Island County? And as you would expect, it's a pretty eclectic mix in terms of leisure, hospitality, health services, retail, professional services. So fairly evenly spread out. And I think this is really indicative of some of the demand we're seeing for workforce housing and low-income housing on the island. Not a surprise to many of you, or if not all of you on this call, is the median sales price in Whidbey Island has gone up 70% in the last 5 years. It's up 22% year over year. So what we've also seen is sort of what we call a shadow market for affordable housing. A lot of times in communities like Whidbey Island, people will be renting in homes, they'll be living with family members. And as the pricing goes up in the market, more homes are sold, that kind of shadow inventory of rental housing starts to diminish as well. So this is an acute effect, not only on affordable home ownership, but there is also a correlation to the effect on the rental market as well. So in terms of South Whidbey in particular, drilling down there, the area median income commensurate with Island County is $68,000. 40% of the South Whidbey Island households make less than $60,000 annually, and 42% are earning between 60 and 150% of area median income. So again, area median income means that half the people are making less and half the people are making more than the stated area income. And we'll get a little bit more into the income bands in a minute here. But what that means on a household basis is that 42% of the households are in that $40,000 to $100,000 household income range. And then, as probably not surprised either, in terms of the housing split, predominantly home ownership, 72%, and 28% respectively for renters. So again, what that's indicating to us is a real lack of supply in the rental market, which again drives up, if there is rental housing, the price point on that. So that's not a surprise. So when we talk low income, it's important to talk about, the vernacular of housing, because there's a lot of terminology people throw out: workforce housing, low income, middle income, market rate. What do these things mean? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But low income housing, really by the definition of HUD, is individuals and households earning 30 to 60% of area median income within that community. So in this case, with the AMI of 68,000, that means household income is in that $20,000 to $40,000 range. And there's different hourly basis rates for that too, but really it's, baristas like you see here, it's people working in the restaurant service industry, often cash wage economies. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about low income wage earners. So the workforce housing. So this is also middle income housing. And so those two terms can be interchanged often. And we'll go through that in a minute, but really this is our essential workforce in many ways, in addition to, low-income housing providers, people living in those, qualifying for those, that type of housing. But really it's healthcare workers, it's teachers, it's civil servants, it's our, essential workforce in terms of firemen, policemen. So really, really important, obviously. And the household income range for that is technically 60 to 120% of area median income. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important, because that ties into the delivery models and financing tools for these types of housing. So what does it mean in terms of affordability? So this is looking at a scale, not to throw too many numbers at the screen here, but looking left to right. So starting with housing classification and getting to my comments on middle income and low income housing on the left-hand side of the screen there, really as you spread across and look at middle income housing, it's those households earning, again, 45 to 99,000 a year, depending on household size. So there's different, formulas and calculations for that, and those tie to your area median income ranges. And really, the way HUD thinks about this, and the way we think about it in the housing world, is any individual or household shouldn't be paying more than 30% of their gross income towards housing. And what we often see, and this is something with Whidbey Island where transit's also really important, is that people will end up spending in their low income and middle income bands, they'll spend 30 to 50% of their income in housing and transportation costs combined. So again, really, really important that we think holistically about the ecosystem of housing, not just for the cost of housing itself, but for the transit that comes with it. So if you take that number and you say, okay, there's, oh, sorry, Grace, Thanks. So if we say, there's a household earning, between 75 and 99,000 a year as a household, what can they afford in rent? We're taking 30% of that, and that's how we're getting that range of 1,875 to 2,500. On the lower end for an individual or household that's, earning 40 to 44,000, they're paying 1,000 to 1,025, 1,125 a month. So that's how we kind of back into those numbers and say, that's a healthy amount. A house, an individual is technically housing burdened if they're paying over 30% in monthly or annual costs towards their housing. And then low income, really for individuals and households earning less than 40,000 a year, the rent's going to be lower than $1,000 a month typically. And we'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Interesting when you look at the for sale piece on affordability here, because really the biggest barrier to home ownership, and in this case, obviously the zoning doesn't permit single family homes, but looking downstream, if there were to be townhomes or co-housing opportunities, one of the biggest barriers to home ownership is down payment. And you can see here, similar annual income range for middle income and low income, and the monthly payment amounts actually are not that far off from what you would pay in rent. The biggest barrier though is putting 20% down, and that can be as much as an entire salary for a year. So that's one of the things that makes it really difficult when you're looking at the financing of affordable homeownership, whether that's in a townhome or co-housing. So one of the things we start with, again, kind of on the macro perspective, is looking at the population and really trying to break it down and thinking about, before we get into the survey results, if you look at the overall South Whidbey population of just under 14,000, and you're looking at that split of renters and owners, breaking it down that way, and then looking at from an affordability standpoint, what we do is we apply a capture rate and say, okay, of all the renters living in South Whidbey Island or the general population, how many of them do we think would live at Bayview? And a lot of that's a function of the affordability, of course, and the accessibility to that housing. So if it's high-end market rate housing that's out of reach and out of price for low-income and middle-income households, then obviously that's not going to work. And so what we do try to do is assign, looking at the affordability, and we'll get into that in a minute, is assign these capture rates and say, okay, out of this percentage and population of people living down there, how many do you think would live in the apartment if they were provided at Bayview? And so looking down below on the bottom of the chart, the capture rates are seeing kind of a range of low, medium, and high. That's 7 to 12.5% of what do we think a likely apartment demand is. And this is kind of current day. This doesn't take into long-term forecasting. There's a lot of other variables about it. It's an imperfect science, but it's one in which we try and do whenever we're looking at kind of the potential demand in the community. And here, just looking at South Whidbey population, we see a range of 50 to 100 apartment units, and that demand is very likely in this community. And if you look below that, you'll see we've assigned a capture rate for sale demand, and the capture rate numbers are a lot lower, and that goes back to the barrier to entry with the down payment. So it's a lot harder to make that pencil for people that haven't been able to save that money, of course. That's a big stretch. So on the for sale piece, really seeing a lower demand. That's why you're seeing that range of 30 to 67 instead of the apartment range there. So that's one way we sort of start coming at it from a higher level, and then we'll get into the survey results in a minute. So in terms of the housing and the typology, this is a slide we like to use to really kind of, I think, drive home the point that, housing is really an interconnected system. And for every 5 to 7% increase in rent, literally thousands of people will fall out of housing and into homelessness. So we sort of like to use this analogy of a housing ladder, not in the sense of hierarchical society constraints, but more just about how important it is to have rungs on those ladders serving people and individuals in various situations in housing, because it's so important to provide that housing stability. And you see that in a lot of communities. What happens if you don't have middle income housing and people fall out of market rate housing? There's no middle income housing. Low income housing is oversubscribed. People can fall into homelessness very easy. So at the top of the ladder, really from a market standpoint, this is your standard market rate housing. Market rate technically is defined as over 120% of area median income. The way it's financed is there's typically private equity and there's private debt often. Fairly straightforward from a financing standpoint. This middle income kind of tranche we've talked about is that 60 to 120% area median income. Again, people that are healthcare workers, teachers, civil servants. And this is where there's a few different tools here. There's a multifamily tax exemption tool that a lot of cities put in place. We don't currently have one in this location, but it's something from a policy standpoint that we want to look at. And that basically allows you, if you set aside a certain number of apartment units at a 80% or less area median income range, you can get a tax exemption on the entire basis for the residential basis for the project. So it's a really effective tool to help promote workforce housing in communities that otherwise wouldn't have them, or the economics working against you. Typical construction debt for financing. And then in terms of the rest of the capital stack, private and philanthropic equity. And so we've been using another project, what we call impact equity, where that's people coming in and individuals, or it can be institutions and companies coming in with impact equity. They're really willing to make an investment where instead of getting a more of a market rate return, where they might be looking for 6 or 7% on their money, they're willing to take a lower rate of return at 2 or 3%. And that can help us both, increase and double the amount and the breadth of affordable housing and workforce housing in a project. So that's a really important tool for creation of middle income housing. And then you get into low income housing. And this is really, really difficult housing to both provide and to finance. As you can see on the right side of the chart, it can be 5 to 7 layers of finance that relies on low income housing tax credits, which is a whole nother probably Zoom call and topic to get into, but a really complex system, highly competitive. Right now, it's oversubscribed in Washington State by about 3 to 1. So there's about 300 million in requests for low income housing tax credits for low income housing projects. And there's about 300 million available, and there's about $1 billion in requests. So really difficult to finance. You also need city and state government funds, other public funding, philanthropic investments, and construction debt. And so there's a timeline, and there's an uncertainty with that as well. And then obviously below is what we're trying to avoid at all costs, is homelessness. And so hopefully this slide at least communicates kind of the different tranches of housing by typology. So after doing kind of the higher level macro demand study and looking at kind of those capture rates I went through, we also issued a demand survey in the community here. It was issued in April, and we've had a great response so far, about 215 respondents overall, and really, really supportive, both for housing located at Bayview as well as a mix of affordability. So 90% of respondents thought Bayview was a really good location for housing. So not surprising there, which is great to see. Some of the key takeaways, we won't go through all of it, but 65% of the respondents want to live long-term in Bayview, and we heard that throughout the survey in a lot of different ways. People are really committed to trying to live on the island if they can, long-term. Again, aligning with what we've seen from the census data, 52% of the households earn $50,000 or less per year. 85% of individuals earn $50,000 or less per year that responded to the survey. This is something where it is important to note there is what we call an inherent survey bias that's built into a lot of these surveys, because the people that are taking the time to respond to a housing survey focused on affordable housing or accessible housing, typically they're the ones that are unfortunately feeling that pain, or really it's a key issue for them. Not always in that position where they're needing workforce housing or low-income housing, but often we see that. And so that's something to kind of take into account here and what you would expect, but also speaking to the really extreme demand and the need for it on the island. 66% of the respondents are about 44 or younger. So really kind of interesting mix. And then 60% of the respondents also housing burden. So that I mentioned that 30% kind of threshold of what they're paying and their income towards housing. 60% of them are over that 30% threshold. And I mentioned the affordability in that location. So, thanks. So again, looking at kind of how it skews on the survey relative to the census data that we cited, really there's a heavy kind of correlation in that 60 to 150% AMI range. So those individuals and households earning that 40 to 100,000. So, over 40% of the respondents were kind of right there. And then as I mentioned in the previous slide, with 85% of the respondents being below 50,000 a year, really, really large demand, and response at that 50% level there. You can go to the next one. So again, overall, really, really strong demand and response. Of the 215 respondents that looked at this, 111 actually answered this question, and 98 response was either very interested or interested in living at Bayview. So really, really strong. So again, if you apply that capture rate just to the survey alone, it supports a demand and a density of minimum 25 apartments to 44 apartments in that location. So again, that's taking all the other kind of population accounting that we did out of it and just looking at this demand from this survey alone. So that's pretty powerful. So what's really what really came through in the survey as well was just that, 50% of the respondents are living in single family homes and making it work. So a lot of them, again, the shadow inventory I mentioned about rental housing, a lot of them are making it work, multi-generational homes, living in the guest bedroom, barn, attached dwelling unit, detached dwelling unit, accessory dwelling unit, whatever they can do to make it work and to stay on the island. Again, giving a little more commentary to this, and this is why the surveys are really, really important in addition to the focus groups that will follow them, is that it's about the human story, and it's about people that are trying to make it work. And we heard this come through a lot in the survey that in this case, this individual had already left Whidbey Island due to their housing situation. A lot of uncertainty with people that are still on the island trying to make it work. But obviously, when you look below here, 40% are responding, over 40, that it's likely that their current housing situation will force them to leave Whidbey Island in the future. So in terms of next steps, what we're going to do is we're going to keep working on the prototype model with the team here and look at different delivery methods for the housing. And again, it ties back to how we can create the best mix possible for affordability and accessibility. And that'll take different shapes and forms for the housing, as well as long-term phase planning. And going back to what Chris had said about the predictability and sustainability is really essential to this. And it also ties in with the infrastructure capacity, and that's a key part of this phasing and where we go. So that's where we are in the housing analysis.
Great, thanks, Jake. So I'm going to walk you through kind of the preliminary ideas that we have about the master planning. So looking at those maps that I shared with you earlier, and sort of zooming into the area of focus here, we looked at a variety of different factors. Talking with our engineers over at MIG, Dave and Mark, we talked about the concerns raised by WSDOT and just thinking through access on and off the highway and not wanting to bring additional traffic on and off the highway. So we talked about how do we minimize and limit the number of cars that might need to do that. So we looked at using Minehold Road and Casper as a way to bring people into an internal circulation route, vehicular circulation that might kind of bisect the site this way, avoiding some of the steeper areas, the heavily wooded areas, the steep slopes, and unstable slopes, and just kind of bringing this internal loop road in that would then tie in with the highway just kind of across from Howard Road. So that would be a one sort of point of entrance in and off the highway. We talked, and these are just very, very preliminary. So don't nobody needs to get worried or tied up with, exact locations of things. But we looked at what might we locate then the first housing, whether it's one or two buildings, and looked at a location sort of at the north end here, thinking about, what I showed earlier, not wanting to do a major logging activity here, knowing that some of this property that the hospital owns might be at play. So just thinking about this might be an easy sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of where could we quickly realistically think about building the housing. The large green sort of square bubbles, squircles as my daughter would call them, are areas that might be the septic fields to support the housing that might go in there. And then associated with that, there would be parking areas that would be necessary. And then we also thought about sort of desire lines where people would walk. So it's one thing to have a road that does this, but somebody that's living here is not going to walk on the road. They're going to look from my apartment building, where can I, what is the visible place that I'm going to walk to? If I'm going to the tap room or the nursery or cafe up there, I'm going to walk straight across in a diagonal. And likewise, I'm going to walk straight to the intersection. So just keeping in mind some of the natural circulation patterns that might be there for pedestrian use. And then thinking about how do we collect stormwater and channel that in a way that that these projects could feed into a system like that. And then thinking about in the future where could there be potential expansion of additional housing, and could there in some long-term, long-distance future, I probably should have made that not solid but dashed, some mixed-use opportunities where there might be housing over additional retail or commercial uses. So that's sort of a preliminary kind of high-level round bubble kind of look at where we're headed with the plan. And that led us to thinking about, it's one thing to plan for where housing might go, but thinking about the character of Bayview and what the community might want it to look like and feel like. This is starting to go a little outside of our scope, but we thought it was really important to think about Bayview as a there. Like, what is the there? Chris and Jean and the folks over at Goosefoot talked a lot about wanting vibrancy and sort of, this walkability, livability, and just kind of a thriving center at Bayview, a thriving center for the locals, not necessarily for, not to replace Langley, but how do you create a place for the island community? So as we were thinking about that and thinking about the experience of driving along the highway, and as you sort of quickly whiz by, if you're not planning or knowing what to look for, that like within a second you could be driving through and you don't realize that you've just driven through. Like my first time to Bayview, did a U-turn and turn around because I didn't realize I'd passed it. So, thinking about what is that experience on the highway as we enter Freeland, you start to see development patterns where there's a little bit of setback. You see the commercial structure set back from the highway. You see the parking lots in front. That's a similar, approach as you come to Coopville. And this sort of entry or approach doesn't signify or kind of demonstrate the vibrancy of, if you drove off the highway to Coopville, this is what you would find, right? And at the same time, Bayview doesn't have that need to drive off. The highway just bisects the community or that raid. Chris mentioned a little bit of the ad hoc sort of nature of development. One of the characters of highway development sometimes looks like this. And so thinking about, how does Bayview want to evolve and develop? Is there a desire for it to be kind of a big city or, grow up in this way of being characterized by large parking lots, or is there a different feel? And I think it's important to think about it at this point before the development starts to happen, as you have time to do incremental changes and start advocating and talking with county planners and things like that, to think about like, what are the ways to signify the arrival at Bayview? So some of the things that we've talked about briefly are, are there ways to signify in the landscape, whether it's through land art, whether it's rolling hills or, a cluster of trees being really dense, or actually art, to signify the entry from either side to Bayview. It could be a strong sort of alley of trees that sort of mark and sort of signify that there's something here. Those types of things cause drivers to slow down, to stop, to pay attention, to wonder something's happening, I should slow down, I should be looking for pedestrians. They could be vertical elements, so it could be pieces of art or sculpture or large natural objects like stones. Those elements could be just color. So thinking about places where, the Skagit tulip fields or the lavender farms in Squim. So how do you think about those kinds of expressions and causing people to slow down as they approach Bayview and stop to pause at what they're approaching? We asked some of our steering committee members to think about or tell us what are some of the things that make you think about Bayview, and recognizing that there's not an identity or an iconic sort of image. I think what we heard resoundingly was that there was a sense of community, of people. And one of the folks on the committee also noted that many years ago, there was a daffodil planting effort. When we showed that last slide of the flowers, somebody brought up the fact that there had been a big daffodil planting campaign, and how remarkable that was when you entered Bayview, that you saw this sort of sea of yellow daffodils. So that's a lot of material very quickly. But these are some of the ideas and thoughts that we've been kind of mulling over and thinking about, just in terms of the overall demand and supply necessary for housing, how the area is ready for the housing, what are some of the placemaking opportunities. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but again, reminding you, if you have questions, we're going to ask, I think if everyone is still muted, everyone to type in questions into the chat window. We'll give you a second to do that. Marion and Sammy are going to be moderating that and asking the questions of the panelists. And we will answer as many questions as we can in the next 35 minutes. And what questions that we don't get to, we will be answering in a fact sheet or a list of questions and answers, even including the ones that were asked today, and those will be posted and made available with the rest of the video of the recording of this. So we shared this timeline at the beginning to talk about sort of the processes that's been to date. Over the next few months and through the end of summer, our team will be looking, as Jake noted, more like focused effort on looking at the planning of and the pro forma of a potential rental housing option. And actually, yeah, I think it's rental housing. We're still sort of analyzing what will be that first project to study in greater detail. And the results of that will be shared with you all as Goosefoot comes back in the fall to talk about sort of the next steps, the learnings and the next steps. Very high level, big picture timeline. If everything was completely lined up, as the question asker asked, this was not Jake's, but Grace's, architect hat wearing Grace's timeline of like how aggressively could we do this if we had donors lined up, the land secured, everybody ready to go. That could look like, you know, getting things ready next year in 2020, identifying those sources of funding and just really pinpointing down how the land transaction would occur, you know, discussing with the county waivers and things like that to help reduce development costs, hiring an architect, and taking it through permitting and design and permitting. You could imagine in 2025 that there would be keys to hand over to renters to move in. That's on a really sort of aggressive, like I said, everything lining up. So if there's any donors out there or property owners interested in stepping up, this is your time to like make this happen. But this is a very aggressive look, but we knew that there would be this question of how quickly could this happen. And we have outlined, like, you know, if there was recognizing that there is this demand and lots of different types of housing, the potential for, you know, project 2 and home ownership things to follow on those heels. But again, this is only if things line up and there is this synergy of community, you know, obviously there is community demand and need for the housing, but who will step up to help make that happen? Because we cannot just wait for the public funding to be the way out of this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Am I turning this over to the Goosefoot folks?
Okay. I'm Sandy Whiting, Executive Director of Goosefoot, and the question came up, what can you do? And as Marion said, sign up for the focus groups. That is number one right there, because I think we're going to have a real variety of focus groups. And I think just about wherever you're coming from, there'll be one for you. So be on the lookout for that. And also, we're going to be doing follow-up surveys. And that data will help us better understand our community's housing needs. So, you know, again, check our website, check our Facebook, call us, find out, you know, when these surveys are coming up, when these focus groups are happening. And finally, we'd like to thank our elected officials who are here. And to them, please stay connected to our Bayview master planning process and help us in these creative ways to support this long-range project. Because it is going to need to be, we're going to need a lot of creativity and some minds all working together to make this happen. So thank you. Now, how to get a hold of us. This will actually be posted in the chat box, so you can copy it out of there, but you can help us by providing feedback via an online survey. You can go to our website and give us feedback, Facebook, contact and feedback, and of course our email. And then if you want to join our email list, you can contact events@org and we'll get you on the email list, or you can plain old-fashioned way call us. So those are the ways to get hold of us and give us more feedback.
I'll just jump in really quickly just to say in the chat box is the link to the questionnaire. So we'd love if everyone could, as many people as possible could take a few minutes to fill that out. Thanks.
Okay.
So we are wrapping up, and we thought we would try to put out something that's really, unless somebody like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It just is not. So we are, Goosefoot and our collaborators and our design team, we are stepping forward. And we can't stand by anymore and wait for someone else to solve the community's issues and problems. So I want to thank you all for joining in, for your questions, for your enthusiasm. By the way, there's been a lot of enthusiasm. And we will keep you posted. There will be more articles, there'll be more invitations coming along. So thank you, and please do answer the questionnaire. We'd like to know, how you felt about this presentation. And again, the questions will be up on the website. There will be a fact sheet, and we'll try to have our design team really dig into those questions and give you some answers to the best that we can. This is, I just want to remind everybody, a really long-term investment in our community. And it does not happen overnight. So we're just at the very, very beginning. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate everyone being here.
Yes, thank you. We do appreciate it very much. Thanks.